June 12, 1944. The fields of Normandy lay shrouded in a thin gray morning mist. The air smelled of wet earth and oil, mingling with the distant tang of gunpowder. Japanese commanders, perched atop a slight rise, scanned the horizon through binoculars, their uniforms damp with dew. The ground beneath them trembled, not from distant steps, but from a rhythm that grew steadily, a low, ominous rumble that seemed to pulse through the soil. Then the first shell struck. The earth erupted in a violent shudder, sending shards of dirt and splintered wood skyward. Officers stumbled, hats blown off, papers scattered, horses rearing in panic. The thunder of the Howitzers rolled across the fields, relentless, precise. Even seasoned veterans froze, eyes wide, trying to comprehend the scale of destruction. Trees snapped like twigs, bunkers shuddered, and lines of infantry faltered under the invisible, crushing weight of artillery fire. For the Japanese commanders, it was more than a barrage. It was a revelation. Every blast tore through assumptions, forcing a stark realization. The ground itself had become an enemy. The tension hung thick, a calm before a storm that would change the battle, and the men forever. By mid-1944, the Pacific and European theaters of World War II had become arenas of relentless escalation. Japan, stretched thin across the Pacific Islands and Southeast Asia, faced increasing pressure from Allied forces. In Europe, Allied advances were accelerating after the successful landings in Normandy, and the lessons learned there would echo across other fronts. Though Japan's main focus was the Pacific, its command structure paid close attention to technological innovations in artillery and combined arms tactics that demonstrated the shifting nature of modern warfare. The Japanese army was organized with meticulous hierarchy. At the divisional level, commanders exercised authority over thousands of men, but the speed and scope of Allied artillery were testing every assumption. Japanese officers relied heavily on reconnaissance, maps, and radio intelligence to anticipate enemy movements, yet much of the Allied planning remained inscrutable. Intelligence reports often underreported the destructive range and precision of American and British howitzers, giving commanders a false sense of security about the battlefield. Artillery had evolved dramatically. By 1944, field howitzers could fire heavy shells with remarkable accuracy over miles, transforming once static defenses into vulnerable targets. These weapons were not just tools of destruction. They were instruments of psychological warfare. The Japanese army, accustomed to frontal assaults and entrenched defensive positions, often found itself unprepared for barrages that could reduce a fortified position to rubble within minutes. In the days leading up to the engagement, Japanese units had established positions along a ridge overlooking a low valley. Troops dug foxholes, reinforced bunkers, and arranged defensive lines, confident that the natural terrain would provide protection. The officers, following traditional doctrines, assumed that artillery fire could be absorbed or mitigated with standard fortifications. Yet intelligence reports had missed subtle but crucial indicators. The Allies had moved additional heavy artillery units into concealed positions, their numbers and range underestimated by Japanese planners. Morale within the ranks was cautious but steady. Soldiers understood the risks of combat, but confidence in their commanders provided a layer of reassurance. Commanders themselves, seasoned by previous campaigns in China and the Pacific, believed in the resilience of their troops and the strategic advantage of high ground. The ridge offered a commanding view of the surrounding farmland, making it easier to coordinate defensive fire and troop movements. Still, beneath the calm professionalism, there was an undercurrent of unease, a subtle acknowledgement that modern artillery had altered the very physics of the battlefield. Every morning, scouts reported movements in the valley below, faint silhouettes of vehicles, the distant shimmer of metal under the sun. Japanese commanders noted these signs but could not anticipate the timing, scale, or intensity of the impending bombardment. The Allies, leveraging intelligence networks and artillery coordination, prepared for a concentrated strike designed not only to inflict casualties, but to shatter command cohesion. The stage was set. Officers reviewed maps, calculated ranges, and issued orders for rotation and coverage. Soldiers moved through trenches, inspecting sandbags and barbed wire. Engineers reinforced observation points, unaware that even the deepest bunkers would tremble under the first shelling. Every action was methodical, almost routine, betraying none of the chaos that was about to arrive. This context, overconfidence, incomplete intelligence, evolving artillery technology, and meticulously prepared defenses, created a fragile equilibrium. One powerful strike, one wave of coordinated fire could upend it entirely. And that strike was imminent. In the days before the bombardment, Japanese units fortified the ridge with methodical precision. Trenches zigzagged across the terrain, connecting reinforced bunkers and machine gun nests. Ammunition caches were buried in shallow pits, while signal flags and runners ensured that commands could travel quickly, even under fire. Engineers examined soil stability and reinforced embankments to withstand what they expected to be sporadic artillery strikes. Commanders briefed their officers daily, emphasizing vigilance and strict adherence to protocol. The preparation was meticulous, yet it relied heavily on assumptions rooted in earlier campaigns. Allied forces, however, had been observing Japanese movements with a far more comprehensive approach. Artillery reconnaissance teams had mapped the terrain, noting ridge lines, valleys, and potential firing zones. Hidden behind tree lines and concealed by undulating fields, heavy howitzers were emplaced at ranges previously untested against the Japanese positions. The Allies coordinated infantry movements with artillery schedules, timing barrages to disrupt supply lines and command communications simultaneously. Every shell's trajectory, velocity, and point of impact had been calculated to maximize both physical destruction and psychological shock. The Japanese command underestimated the extent of Allied preparation. Reconnaissance had detected some enemy artillery positions, but missed the depth of coordination between units. Communications intercepts suggested only sporadic shelling, rather than the impending concentrated barrage. Commanders, confident in their defensive fortifications, failed to consider the increasing accuracy and explosive power of modern Allied howitzers. The valley below, which had seemed a mere stretch of farmland, was in reality a meticulously prepared killing zone for the incoming shells. Troop movements were equally calculated. Infantry units rotated positions along the ridge to maintain readiness. Artillery units positioned secondary firing points to protect against flanking attacks, and engineers inspected the integrity of bunkers and foxholes. Yet, despite the outward appearance of calm and control, the soldiers carried an unspoken tension. Long-range artillery was a known threat, but the scale and precision of Allied firepower remained largely abstract to those stationed there. The night before the assault, commanders held final briefings. Maps covered tables, markers indicating Allied positions and anticipated trajectories. Orders emphasized discipline under fire. Hold positions, conserve ammunition, and relay signals promptly. Scouts returned with reports of distant rumblings, the faint echo of engines and movement across the valley. Japanese officers interpreted these noises cautiously, believing them to be supply convoys rather than indicators of the massive artillery deployment hidden in forests and folds of terrain beyond sight. Meanwhile, Allied forward observers adjusted their coordinates and confirmed firing ranges. Howitzers, some relocated from distant positions to maintain surprise, were calibrated for both maximum range and destructive effect. Calculations considered wind, soil composition, and even barometric pressure to ensure that each shell would strike with lethal precision. The strategy was as much psychological as physical. An unrelenting roar of explosions designed to disorient and destabilize command structures long before infantry made contact. By dawn, the ridge was ready, and Japanese commanders believed they had accounted for every eventuality. Soldiers were positioned, communication lines tested, and defenses inspected one last time. Yet, in the stillness of early morning, the air held a subtle tension, almost imperceptible, a prelude to the violent shaking that would soon redefine the battlefield. The Japanese army, confident in preparation but unaware of the full scale of enemy power, stood on the precipice of a historic and devastating moment. The first angle is human, the visceral, immediate experience of those on the ridge. Soldiers had trained for months, sometimes years, to face battle under disciplined conditions. Yet nothing in their experience prepared them for the sensation of the ground itself rebelling. Each shell fired by Allied howitzers produced a tremor that traveled through the soil, rattling bones and buckling knees. Men instinctively ducked into trenches, gripping rifles as if the metal could shield them from shock waves that no armor could absorb. Officers barked orders, but their voices were often lost to the cacophony of explosions. The air, heavy with dust and the sharp tang of cordite, clung to lungs, forcing every breath to carry the taste of impending danger. Fear was immediate, but it was not panic. Japanese discipline held the lines together, even as the earth cracked and timbers splintered. Yet morale fractured in subtle ways. Younger soldiers, new to the front, flinched at every blast, glancing at comrades for reassurance. Even seasoned veterans, hardened by campaigns across China and the Pacific, struggled to reconcile the calm command structure they had been taught with the raw, overwhelming force raining down upon them. The human cost was as much psychological as physical. Commanders had to maintain composure while witnessing the relentless destruction of positions they had painstakingly fortified. From a tactical perspective, the situation exposed vulnerabilities long underestimated. The ridge, once a defensive advantage, became a trap under concentrated artillery fire. Japanese strategies relied on static defense and pre-planned firing arcs. Foxholes and bunkers could protect against small arms fire or sporadic shelling, but the precision and volume of Allied howitzers rendered these measures insufficient. The earthworks that had taken hours to construct collapsed under sustained bombardment, and lines of soldiers, forced to adjust positions rapidly, became easy targets for follow-up strikes. Commanders attempted countermeasures. Artillery units tried to locate the source of the incoming fire, adjusting trajectories and signaling for suppression fire. Infantry squadrons shifted positions to minimize exposure, moving through shallow trenches and wooded patches. Yet every movement came at a cost. The pace of shelling was faster than Japanese units could recalibrate. Communication lines were severed by explosions, leaving isolated pockets of troops to rely on initiative alone. Tactical flexibility, long prized in Japanese military doctrine, was hampered by the speed and unpredictability of modern artillery barrages. The combined human and tactical impact created a feedback loop. Fear slowed reaction times, which exposed vulnerabilities, which in turn increased casualties and psychological strain. Commanders observed their soldiers' hesitation with mounting concern. Orders were repeated, sometimes shouted, sometimes signaled through runners navigating shattered trenches. Even with strict discipline, the reality of modern artillery disrupted conventional tactics, forcing improvisation under extreme duress. This section also highlights the interaction between perception and battlefield reality. Japanese commanders, trained to read the terrain and anticipate enemy movements, found themselves misreading the battlefield. The ridge's elevation, previously a defensive asset, now amplified the effect of the bombardment. Soldiers huddled in depressions, expecting protection, only to find that the ground beneath could not absorb the energy of the shells. Tactics that had succeeded in prior campaigns failed here, demonstrating how technological evolution could render traditional strategies obsolete in an instant. The human and tactical angles converge in a single, undeniable truth. The Japanese command, confident in preparation and terrain advantage, faced a new reality. Howitzers were not just weapons. They were instruments of shock and control, capable of breaking morale, disorganizing formations, and reshaping the battlefield before a single infantry engagement occurred. The ridge, meticulously fortified and manned by disciplined troops, had become a proving ground for the destructive potential of coordinated artillery. From a technological perspective, the howitzers themselves were marvels of modern warfare. These artillery pieces combined range, accuracy, and explosive force in a manner that Japanese commanders had not fully anticipated. Capable of launching shells over several kilometers, they could strike entrenched positions with pinpoint precision, rendering conventional defenses nearly obsolete. The sound of a shell in flight, a whistling, slicing arc through the sky, was immediately recognizable to Japanese soldiers. Each impact caused tremors, sending fragments of earth, timber, and metal in unpredictable directions. The psychological effect was as significant as the physical damage. Every blast forced commanders to reconsider long-held assumptions about the limits of artillery and the vulnerability of static positions. Command decisions were equally tested under this technological onslaught. Japanese leadership, structured around hierarchy and discipline, relied on centralized communication and pre-planned responses. Officers had to maintain composure while observing the unprecedented destruction of defensive positions. Reports of damage arrived piecemeal, with runners and signal flags struggling to navigate shattered trenches. Some commanders attempted counter-battery fire, but without accurate intelligence on the hidden positions of Allied howitzers, these efforts were largely symbolic. The leadership challenge was not just tactical, it was existential, balancing the need to issue orders with the recognition that the battlefield itself had become unpredictable, controlled as much by physics and engineering as by human command. The enemy perspective provides crucial insight into the orchestration of this moment. Allied forces had studied Japanese defensive patterns, learned from previous encounters, and leveraged superior reconnaissance and artillery coordination. Forward observers calculated ranges, adjusted for environmental factors, and synchronized firing schedules. Each shell was part of a broader strategy: to disorient, to disrupt command cohesion, and to exploit weaknesses in fortifications. The Japanese ridge, elevated and fortified, seemed formidable from afar, but the Allies understood that concentrated artillery could neutralize the advantage. Precision and timing were key. The barrage was designed to maintain relentless pressure, preventing Japanese units from regrouping or mounting an effective counterattack. This intersection of technology, leadership, and enemy strategy underscores a transformative moment in warfare. The Japanese commanders' reliance on experience and doctrine collided with modern artillery's destructive capability. The Allies' preparation and execution demonstrated how intelligence, engineering, and coordination could overcome even the most disciplined opposition. Soldiers experienced the terror of physical destruction. Leaders faced moral and tactical dilemmas, and the enemy executed a plan that combined science, strategy, and psychological insight. The technological and leadership angles also reveal the human consequences of innovation in warfare. Soldiers endured relentless bombardment, adapting as best they could, while officers grappled with the limits of control. Decisions had to be made in real time, under conditions where maps, calculations, and assumptions were constantly challenged by the realities of exploding shells and shifting earth. The enemy's mastery of artillery emphasized not just superior firepower, but the integration of observation, calculation, and timing into a cohesive, devastating strategy. Even after the initial shock of bombardment, Japanese commanders faced cascading challenges. Communication breakdowns delayed reinforcements, logistical lines were disrupted, and previously planned maneuvers became impractical. Every moment under fire magnified the impact of technology and enemy preparation. What had seemed a manageable defensive posture became an urgent struggle to maintain coherence and control. The leadership, tested as never before, demonstrated both the resilience and limitations of human command in the face of mechanized devastation. Ultimately, this multifaceted analysis of technology, leadership, and the enemy highlights why the Japanese commanders were stunned. The howitzers were not merely weapons. They represented a convergence of science, strategy, and psychological power. The battlefield became a dynamic, unforgiving environment where traditional defenses, human skill, and prior experience were challenged by superior preparation and destructive potential. The ridge, once a symbol of tactical advantage, now stood as a testament to the overwhelming capabilities of modern artillery. June 13, 1944. Dawn broke over the ridge with an eerie calm, the mist lingering like a veil over the valley below. Japanese commanders had risen early, inspecting trenches and bunkers, confident that preparation and discipline would withstand any enemy advance. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. The first American shells screamed across the sky, striking with a force that tore through earth and timber alike. The initial impact was catastrophic. Trees closest to the blast were reduced to jagged splinters. Wooden bunkers buckled, some collapsing entirely, burying equipment and injuring the soldiers inside. The ground itself seemed to convulse, a rolling wave of shock that knocked men off their feet. Officers shouted orders, but their voices were swallowed by the deafening roar. Panic flickered across the faces of younger soldiers, while veterans clutched trenches and mud, trying to anchor themselves against forces they could not see but could feel in every bone. Japanese commanders, accustomed to managing battlefield chaos, were stunned. Every preconception about terrain advantage, fortification strength, and enemy capability was being systematically destroyed. Observing from slightly higher ground, one officer noted that the ridge, once considered a natural barrier, was now exposed, every movement a potential death sentence. Reports began to trickle in, supply lines disrupted, communication cables severed, observation posts obliterated. The cadence of destruction was relentless, each blast precisely timed, each shell calculated to dismantle cohesion before infantry engagement. The soldiers' response was immediate but constrained by circumstance. Infantry units scrambled to reposition, attempting to minimize exposure while maintaining defensive lines. Artillery crews, tasked with returning fire, worked feverishly to locate the hidden enemy batteries. But the howitzers had been carefully concealed behind undulating terrain and forest cover. Each attempt to identify their location was met with renewed devastation. The Japanese command quickly realized that their counter-battery measures, based on prior experience and assumptions, were inadequate against an opponent who had mastered both observation and artillery coordination. Morale, though strained, held enough to prevent total collapse. Men relied on drilled instincts, ducking into trenches, coordinating signals through runners, and maintaining communication wherever possible. Yet the psychological toll was undeniable. The shock of the ground shaking underfoot, combined with the unpredictability of shell impacts, forced soldiers to confront the fragility of their positions. Officers moved among the men, attempting to project confidence while processing their own astonishment. Every explosion demanded a split-second judgment. Order reinforcement, retreat, or simply survive the next blast. The tactical reality became painfully clear. Static defensive positions, once the foundation of Japanese strategy, were no match for sustained, concentrated artillery. The ridge's natural elevation amplified, rather than mitigated, the destructive power of the shells. Trenches and bunkers that had seemed sufficient were torn apart, leaving soldiers exposed. Movement became a dangerous necessity. Staying put invited annihilation, but fleeing exposed units to both artillery and small arms fire. Commanders faced the impossible task of orchestrating resistance while the battlefield itself was redefined with each explosion. By mid-morning, the cumulative effect was evident. Observation posts had been destroyed, supply lines disrupted, and the cohesion of frontline units was under severe strain. Japanese commanders, who had arrived confident in preparation and defensive advantage, now confronted a new reality. The howitzers were not merely weapons of destruction, they were instruments of tactical dominance, capable of controlling the tempo, psychology, and structure of the battlefield. The initial engagement ended not with a decisive infantry clash, but with an unmistakable lesson. The ground itself could be wielded as a weapon. The Japanese command, stunned and disoriented, had to reassess every assumption. The battle was no longer a test of conventional strategy. It had become a confrontation with the overwhelming destructive potential of modern artillery. By late morning, the bombardment had reached its peak. The ridge, once a symbol of Japanese defensive strength, now resembled a shattered landscape. Trees had been reduced to jagged stumps. Trenches were flooded with mud from shell craters, and bunkers lay in ruin. The rhythm of explosions was relentless, each detonation reshaping the terrain and fracturing the remaining cohesion of Japanese forces. Smoke and dust filled the air, obscuring vision and amplifying confusion. Commanders, who had once relied on observation from the high ground, could no longer see the full scope of the battlefield. The human toll was staggering. Soldiers struggled to maintain positions amid flying debris and collapsing earthworks. Communications broke down completely in some sectors, isolating units and leaving officers to improvise under extreme duress. Despite discipline and training, panic began to surface among inexperienced troops. Even veterans were forced into reactive survival mode, abandoning pre-planned maneuvers in favor of immediate cover. The psychological impact of sustained artillery fire proved as destructive as the shells themselves, eroding confidence and decision-making capacity at every level of command. Tactically, the Japanese defensive line disintegrated. Foxholes offered minimal protection against repeated blasts, and the concentrated nature of the bombardment prevented soldiers from regrouping effectively. Commanders attempted to coordinate countermeasures, but the visibility and communication issues rendered many efforts futile. Allied artillery had not only destroyed physical fortifications, but also neutralized the strategic advantage of the ridge. What had been a high-ground defense now became a liability, its elevation amplifying exposure rather than providing protection. The momentum of the battlefield shifted decisively. Allied forces, having established complete artillery dominance, began to coordinate infantry movements in tandem with the barrage. Japanese units, weakened and disoriented, could offer only fragmented resistance. The precision of the shells ensured that command posts, supply routes, and troop concentrations were systematically targeted, leaving few opportunities for recovery. Every shell reinforced the tactical reality. The Japanese defense, once meticulously organized, was now at the mercy of superior firepower and preparation. Commanders faced impossible choices. Reinforcing positions risked moving troops into zones of concentrated shelling. Retreat offered the possibility of survival, but left key positions exposed to capture. Each decision had immediate and lethal consequences. Observing the chaos, some officers attempted to stabilize the line by reallocating units, but without cohesive communication, these efforts were piecemeal. The battlefield itself dictated outcomes, highlighting a grim truth. Artillery had become the dominant factor in modern engagements, capable of determining success before infantry even collided. Amid the destruction, strategic implications became evident. Japanese planners realized that assumptions about terrain, fortification, and troop resilience were no longer sufficient against coordinated artillery strikes. The traditional model of layered defense, reliant on high ground and rigid command structures, was being invalidated. Allied forces, in contrast, demonstrated a mastery of integration, artillery, reconnaissance, and infantry working in unison to control the battlefield. The success of the bombardment did not merely inflict casualties. It reshaped the operational landscape, forcing a re-evaluation of Japanese tactics and strategic priorities in the region. By early afternoon, The peak of destruction had passed, leaving a ridge scarred and largely depopulated. Survivors regrouped where possible, but the psychological and physical toll was profound. Commanders, stunned by the efficiency and ferocity of the Howitzers, understood that the battle had entered a new phase, one defined by reactive measures rather than proactive strategy. The Allies had seized not only terrain but initiative, setting the conditions for subsequent operations that would exploit the shock and disorganization inflicted by the artillery barrage. The transformation of the battlefield was unmistakable. Once a position of calculated advantage, the ridge had become a testament to the destructive potential of modern artillery and the limits of traditional defensive doctrine. The Japanese command, shaken and disoriented, faced the stark reality of a conflict where firepower, coordination, and psychological impact could dictate the course of events before soldiers ever engaged in hand-to-hand combat. The stage was set for the aftermath, where losses, lessons, and the consequences of this unprecedented bombardment would become fully apparent. By late afternoon, the ridge had been transformed from a fortified defensive position into a fragmented and chaotic landscape. Trenches were gouged by cratered earth, bunkers reduced to splintered timber and rubble. Japanese soldiers who survived the initial barrage moved cautiously, scanning the horizon for further artillery strikes. The regiment, once organized and disciplined, was now fractured into isolated groups, each struggling to maintain cohesion amid the debris and psychological toll. The immediate toll on personnel was severe. Reports indicate that casualty rates in key sectors exceeded initial expectations. Many soldiers were buried in collapsed bunkers or incapacitated by flying debris. Commanders themselves suffered under the pressure of lost communications, disrupted supply lines, and the overwhelming speed of destruction. Even units that had avoided direct hits were forced into reactive positions, constantly adjusting to incoming fire. The ground, once a platform for defense, had become an unpredictable hazard. Supply and communication lines were heavily impacted. Cables and signal flags lay shredded across the cratered landscape. Runners attempting to carry orders were intercepted or incapacitated, leaving certain units to operate autonomously. Ammunition and food stocks, buried in shallow pits, were destroyed or rendered inaccessible. Commanders were forced to make decisions with incomplete information, relying on intuition and pre-existing plans rather than real-time updates, a dangerous compromise in the heat of battle. From a tactical standpoint, the ridge's defensive utility had been nullified. Units that had relied on elevation to observe and coordinate fire found themselves exposed to the unseen enemy. The concentration of Allied howitzers had not only destroyed physical defenses, but had also sapped the capacity for organized resistance. Counter-battery fire was largely ineffective. The hidden positions of the artillery, combined with their devastating accuracy, ensured that Japanese forces could not regain initiative. Despite the chaos, pockets of resistance persisted. Small groups of soldiers regrouped in surviving trenches or makeshift cover, attempting to consolidate positions and establish rudimentary observation points. Officers encouraged these efforts, emphasizing the need to maintain order and morale. Yet every movement was measured against the reality of further bombardment, forcing a delicate balance between tactical necessity and survival. The first reports to higher command conveyed both the scale of destruction and the unexpected efficiency of Allied firepower. Senior Japanese officers, accustomed to evaluating battlefield situations from distance, now faced the unnerving reality that their units were being overwhelmed not by infantry assaults, but by the sheer mechanical and psychological weight of artillery. Messages stressed immediate defensive measures, reinforcements where possible, and contingency plans for retreat or reorganization. By evening, the immediate consequences were clear. The ridge had lost its value as a defensive stronghold. Troop cohesion was compromised, and Japanese commanders were forced into a reactive stance. The battlefield had been reshaped by technology, precision, and tactical foresight. leaving the Japanese forces to adapt under immense pressure. The initial shock had passed, but the implications, casualties, disarray, and strategic disadvantage would reverberate far beyond the day's engagement. In the days following the bombardment, the full scope of its consequences became evident. Japanese commanders faced a grim reality. Their defensive doctrine, meticulously honed over years of prior campaigns, had been rendered insufficient against modern artillery. The ridge, once considered a tactical stronghold, no longer offered security or leverage. Commanders had to contend not only with the physical destruction of positions, but with the profound psychological impact on their troops. Fear and uncertainty had replaced confidence, and the ability to maintain disciplined coordination was severely compromised. Strategically, the event forced an immediate reassessment of Japanese operational planning. Reports from surviving officers detailed the effectiveness of Allied artillery, the coordination between fire and infantry movements, and the precision with which critical command and supply points had been neutralized. These insights highlighted vulnerabilities that could no longer be ignored. High Command recognized that traditional reliance on static fortifications and high ground advantage was now a liability in the face of coordinated long-range bombardments. Future defensive efforts required mobility, dispersion, and adaptability, concepts that had previously been secondary in Japanese doctrine. The psychological toll extended beyond the battlefield. Soldiers who had survived the bombardment reported persistent anxiety, mistrust of terrain, and hesitation in subsequent engagements. The memory of the ground shaking beneath them, the deafening roar of shells, and the sudden collapse of bunkers created lasting trauma. Commanders, aware of the erosion of morale, struggled to restore confidence, implement new strategies, and maintain cohesion. Even small victories felt tenuous, overshadowed by the overwhelming impression of vulnerability imposed by artillery superiority. Allied forces, conversely, capitalized on both the physical and psychological effects of the bombardment. By demonstrating mastery over range, timing, and terrain, they gained not only control of the battlefield, but also leverage over the enemy's perception of possibility. Japanese units became hesitant to maneuver, overcautious in their decisions, and reactive rather than proactive. This allowed Allied infantry and mechanized units to advance with reduced resistance, turning the initial artillery barrage into a decisive strategic advantage that extended beyond immediate casualties. The destruction of the ridge also altered subsequent tactical doctrine. Japanese commanders who survived the engagement documented the limitations of traditional fortifications and the necessity of integrating mobility and counter-artillery measures. These lessons, though learned at high cost, would influence later defensive strategies, emphasizing dispersed positions, reinforced underground bunkers, and rapid communication protocols designed to mitigate the overwhelming effect of concentrated firepower. From a broader historical perspective, this event demonstrated the transformative role of artillery in modern warfare. Howitzers, once considered merely supportive weapons, proved capable of dictating the rhythm of engagements, reshaping terrain, and undermining command structures before infantry combat began. The battlefield itself became an instrument of strategy, controlled by those who could combine technology, reconnaissance, and coordination. Japanese commanders, once confident in the superiority of terrain and preparation, experienced firsthand the limits of doctrine in the face of innovation. By the end of this period, the ridge stood as a cautionary testament. Technology and preparation could override even disciplined troops and skilled leadership. The immediate losses, casualties, shattered fortifications, and disrupted communications were compounded by a lasting psychological impact and a necessary shift in strategic thinking. For the Japanese commanders who survived, the lesson was indelible. Warfare had evolved, and the ground itself could no longer be relied upon as an ally. The bombardment of the ridge was more than a tactical victory. It was a moment that revealed the evolving nature of warfare. For Japanese commanders, The experience forced a reckoning with the power of technology, coordination, and psychological influence. The Howitzers did not merely destroy bunkers or trenches. They redefined the battlefield itself, turning terrain into an instrument of strategy and reshaping the rules of engagement. What had once been assumed as secure became perilously exposed, demonstrating that preparation and discipline alone could no longer guarantee safety. This event also highlighted the human dimension of modern warfare. Soldiers faced not only physical threats, but the psychological weight of a ground that seemed to rebel underfoot. Commanders, though trained in strategy and leadership, were forced to confront the limits of control when faced with a relentless, unseen force. The interplay between human resilience and technological superiority became starkly evident, a reminder that innovation often reshapes both perception and reality in the theater of war. Strategically, the battle served as a lesson in adaptability. The destruction forced Japanese forces to reconsider doctrines, to recognize the necessity of mobility, and to integrate countermeasures against concentrated artillery. The Allies' coordination demonstrated that mastery of observation, timing, and technology could determine outcomes before conventional combat even began. The ridge, once a defensive advantage, became a symbol of the transformative potential of modern artillery and the need for flexibility in military planning. Ultimately, this moment stands as a reflection on the enduring relationship between human endeavor and technological power. It reminds us that warfare is not static, that strategy and preparation are constantly challenged by innovation, and that the ground beneath one's feet can become both stage and adversary. For history, the event underscores how pivotal moments, measured in seconds of shock and destruction, can ripple through tactics, morale, and doctrine, shaping not only the course of battles, but the understanding of what it means to command, endure, and adapt in war.